Okay, folks. This little series I'm talking about is ServiceNow Architecture Extras, where I'm trying to bridge the gaps between some of the things we cover in classes and, some of the things that we sometimes wish we knew more of in the platform table architecture of ServiceNow. And so I had used a diagram before, and I've kind of been building through it. Right, in the first session, we just kind of talked about this being the architecture. And then we went through a list of requirements in which we kind of said, hey, what if we were to build a table? And we talked about the fact that all these pieces are touched when we build a table. We kind of mentioned jokingly McLean's law, right? Everything is a record in a table. So when I build this airports table, actually all these other tables get touched or built. And then we kind of talked a little bit about that and about update sets and how update sets are kind of recorders that collect all of these core tables that are used to help support or manage the behavior of this one table that we're building. And then in the very last version, we actually got to building the table. And when we did so, we saw that building that table actually also built us menus, modules, which are of course records in the menu table, records in the module table, potentially roles, which would be records in the role table, and access controls, which would be records in the access control table. And if I wanted to, for that table, even numbers, which would be records over here somewhere in an auto number table. So all of those things were done when we built the table. The other thing that was built that I hinted at that we're going to dive in this session is to talk a little bit about forms. Now, forms and lists, of course, are actually also stored in a table. And so we're going to take a look at that in this little session. And as with the other ones, where possible, if I can kind of sneak an extra little trick in there, I will. In the modules, we snuck like the fact that you could put an emoji in there. But so now we're going to kind of come over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to remember that, as I said, when I built the table airport, it automatically built the menu and module airports. And as we did that, when we went to the airports, the system, by saying, hey, create new, generated a record in that form for me. And when I looked at that form, it wasn't perfectly laid out. So we're going to talk about a couple of different ways to manage that form building. Now, we're not going to talk about workspaces at this point. I've got other videos in the future to talk about that. We're talking about the classic interface. And in that classic interface, if we look, if this isn't laid out, there are two different ways we can manage this. If we click over here in the additional actions, this is sometimes referred to as the hamburger. It is sometimes referred to as the tri-bar. There's about 6 other names for it. We could also get to the same thing by right-clicking anywhere in the header. But if we do so, we get to this option of configure. And if we look at configure, we have 2 different ways to manage form design and form layout. Now, I'm going to actually go to both of them so that we kind of see what are the pluses and minuses. And I'm going to start, of course, with form design. That's the more modern of the two. And if I open form design, we notice it pops another tab. One of the things that I use as a hint to me, architecturally speaking, is when I see a tab pop open like that, it usually means the system is using more modern code base. So things like AngularJS or React, which you may or may not need to know about that stuff, but those are 2 code bases that allow more interaction. So it allows for things like pop-ups and drag and drops and that kind of functionality. So the classic view, when we look through here, maybe a little less reactive, right? But if we need to do something new or fancy and we click, like we did Form Designer, the system brings up a new tab so that it can use and take advantage of kind of more modern functionality. Now, one of the cool things about that functionality is it's very drag and drop. So I could do, because really when you think about airports, it's probably going to be, right, airport name and then airport code. And so you can see I'm just kind of dragging them around using the little handle, right? So that looks decent to me. Airport name, airport code, nearest office location, number. Airport notes, the system actually picked up because when I built the field in the dictionary, that field was going to be string data, but 200 characters. And because it was going to be longer, the system said, well, I'll build, and this is kind of cool to notice, I'll build a new section. So when we talk about building out sections, it's kind of handy to note that when I go to do that in here, it's very easy to click this button, and you can see it'll add a new section. Now this is also interesting because when I look at the form as it currently exists, notice that there's no breaks between those sections. If I wanted to, so this kind of, I think, fits us in that extras area, right? If I wanted a break, all I need to do is name the section. So for instance, in this layout as it currently is, I have airport name, airport code, nearest office location, and airport number. Now, maybe I want to change this. This is easy to do, and I'll get to that in just a minute, but we were talking sections. So we know that this is 2 column, this is 1 column, and that makes good sense. But these other things like map and alert level or those kind of things, I might want that kind of separated. So I might put this, maybe I'll call it additional information. And then I'll save it. This is one of the other things about the form design. When I do things in form design, I have to kind of mark that's the case. Now, the thing to keep in mind as I do these kinds of changes, so there's that. Maybe I'm going to call this record number or airport identifier number or something like that. I can come over here to the gear, and I can easily change the label without changing the name. And that's good to note because they're kind of separate objects. Now, one of the cool things about them being separate objects, everything being a separate record in a separate element in a separate field in a separate table, right, is that for internationalization purposes, or sometimes referred to as localization purposes, if I wanted to change the language, I could change all of the labels. And in fact, by coming up with a different language table, I could import that language table to the labels table. And then every label for every field in every piece of every part of ServiceNow would reflect that new language. So it's kind of cool to understand that underlying bit of the architecture. Again, kind of getting to some of the extras in here. So all I need to do is I can say that's the airport identifier number. And, you know, I guess from organizational purposes, maybe I'll do it this way. And you'll notice what happened was it kind of got dragged over and into the fields side of things. And of course, when that happened, I lost the numbering. So I'll come back to airport identifier. Right? And even spelling things we can kind of fix. So airport identification number. And if I do that, and again, I'll click save. So this is using forms design, and that's kind of convenient for me. And I can drag, of course, any of the fields that have already been created. You'll notice I have formatters, again, another cool thing to talk about at some point. But if I wanted to add a new field, just like I added a field to the dictionary in the previous session, I can create a new type of field here. And maybe I can, you know, calendar date, currency. I'm trying to think of one that I could maybe bring in that might be useful. I don't know. You know, maybe I'm trying to think of something simple. Maybe I'll put a date and time field in here for, because it's date and time, I could put in, most airports are open all the time, right? So I'll bring in a string field, and maybe it'll be, you know, nearby restaurants or good restaurants or something like that. Now, when I do a field in forms design, and I look, and I go to the gear, you'll notice what it does. Because it calls everything new string, I now have to name both the label and the string field. And so I have to do the same thing here too, where I have string 1. which may seem fine in this case, but as things get bigger, then I have a table that's string 1, string 2, string 3, string. That's not very useful to people when I import or export data or when I integrate. So I'll call this U restaurants. Maybe I'll do 1 because I'm not doing a list of them. I'm just doing, what's the best restaurant for us to have office meetings if we happen to be at this airport. I know it's a bit of a reach, but it's what I got. So that's building a field and all of the things they do in form design. And when I save that, let's do that and take a look. Obviously, you'll notice it's not changing on the fly. However, if I either refresh, you'll notice now, let's take a look at some of the things that have happened, right? This suddenly has that break in it, the section break. And we notice that we have the other fields moved across. And we saw that when we went to add a new field using the form designer, we had to make sure we added both fields. So this is kind of nice to see, and some simple and cool adds in there that I hope were helpful in the form design. I'm going to close form design out though, and I'm going to point out 2 other things. One, I'm going to go out here and go into, instead of design, form layout. Now form layout is the old way to do this. And if I look at form layout, you'll notice it's nowhere near as graphic. It's done in the classic format. And in that, I have it does the same things. But as it does the same things, you can see there's a little bit of difference, right? You can see that, for instance, among other pieces that are in here, it brings out things by split. So when I see about things as splits, what I really mean is everything above the split is to the left side and everything below the split is to the right side. So it's the same idea, it's just a slightly different way about thinking about things. And we had airport code and airport identification number, and I think it might look better if this was over on the left side. So to make it on the left side, I'll go like that. And then, of course, to make this one on the right side, I'll put it on the split beneath airport code. Now, if I were to build a new field using this method, I'm going to show you, all I need to do down here is say some new airport field. So let's do that. And again, I can choose whatever data type I want, and that's kind of handy. And when I build that by default, it'll be down in the, and this becomes a little problematic too, because remember, I built my sections. Now in the graphic format, of course, I can drag and drop the components. But if I go into, I don't want that to be in this top section, and I don't want it to be under airports notes. I want this to be maybe under additional information. So I have to identify that section. And the system prompts me, do you want to save the sections first? So in the record that stores the form, and I'm going to get to that in a minute because these are actually records in a table. In the record that stores that form, the sections are broken out. So that's kind of good to know. So in this case, right, I saved the initial view, and then in this one, I had additional information, and it says alert map and alert level, and then it says restaurant, and then I have some new airport field, and I'll add that, and you'll see it appears there. Now, the way this is going to appear when I actually look at the record is I'll have the airport name, airport code, airport number, location, and then I'll have the notes field, and then I'll have this other section for additional information. So you can see that the form layout does the same thing as form design. The big difference is when I built this, remember I just built a label. And so when I save, it brings me back, and you can see this is some new airport field. But the difference is, remember when I built the new field in Designer, I had to do it in both places, the label and the record, or the record and the field name. But here, if I use this cool trick by right-clicking the field and going to show, it did that for me, right? it created the field name and the field label by transposing whatever I wrote in the label and making it all undercase and all spaced. Now, the last point I wanted to point out in the form side of the architecture is that all of this stuff is actually a record in a table. And the name of that table is SysUI form. When you look at lists, the name of that table is SysUI list. Now, there's a cool trick when you know ServiceNow, and like I said, my goal in this was to always kind of sneak in a little extra. So my little extra this time is this. If we look at the name of the table that we're looking at in ServiceNow on the platform, if we were to add dot, then we can add list. If I add dot list, the system brings this as a list of records. So I'm looking at the name of the table was SysUI form, right? But this is a list of all of the forms that are in ServiceNow. And if I sort by updated, there's my airport form. This is what that record, that form that I'm looking at, actually looks like in its table view. You can see that the form is split into sections. Each of the sections is, wait for it, a record in another table. So the sections are records in the form table. So there's yet another table connected to all this. So hopefully what's happening as we go through these sessions is you're starting to get a real feel for just how table-y ServiceNow is, and understanding that architecture, even when you get to things that you may not have encountered before, you know that under the covers somewhere, it's probably a record in a table, and that's what you're looking for. So as we start to get this sense of architecture, and we start to look to this diagram again, we start to go, okay, so we've actually, in building tables in the previous lab, we built menus and modules and roles and access controls. Now we see how we could build forms or lists. And we learned that cool little trick of table name .list. Now there's a lot of other things we can do besides the table name .list. So for instance, I could also capital list, in which case it will make it appear as a list, but on a new tab. So it pops that way. So that's kind of handy to know, right? Another variation of that is whatever table I'm looking at, dot form. This is the blank version of the record's base or default form. So this is what I fill out when I'm building a new form. So even though in the real world, regardless of whether I'm using Form Designer or Form Layout, I'm kind of adding pieces. What's happening is I drag and drop those pieces or use a builder to do that, is I'm just creating a record in this form table that will have form sections in it. So as we've learned, we've got these little table-driven shortcuts, right? There's .list, .capital list, .form, .capital form, and there's 2 or 3 other really cool ones that I'm going to print out for you at the end of this video. But for now, I hope you've learned a couple of architecture extras, right? You've learned that there are 2 different ways to manage the forms, the layout and the designer. You've also learned that there's a cool way to get to any table's architecture simply by going to table name .list or .form. You've also learned the differences between designer, which is very drag and drop, and layout, which lets you add fields very easily and also creates the underlying field, what we would refer to sometimes as the SQL name or the table specific name of the field for you. So those are kind of some adds and extras. Now, next up when we get to our diagram, and it was great, one of the people commented that they were wondering if I was going to go through the other components. I absolutely am. In the next sections, we'll start talking about the difference between client side, so above the waterline, and server side, so below the waterline. And we'll talk about all of the table objects that are wrapped around our airports table that can change the way we interact with the table and kind of the look and feel and behavior of the table. So those are things in upcoming sections, and I hope that this has been useful. I hope that this has been valuable, and I hope that you'll give me feedback with, hey, could you do more of? So yeah, let me know.